Pavel Atanasov. He was on the panel yesterday. He's co-founder of Pitho. He is a decision scientist with a product development bent. He was postdoc scholar at Good Judgment. His PhD is in psychology and decision processes from Penn. So go ahead, Pavel.
Thank you. Thank you, David, and for having me over. This is joint work with Jens Witkowski, Barbara Mellers, and Philip Tetlock. I just want to make sure that you're seeing my screen. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So imagine that you're a manager who is running a corporate prediction market like Bocalgo, let's say at Google, Ford, or Firmax, some large company. And then you have two concerns. One is you want to find a way to make the forecasts more accurate. And the other one is you want to increase privacy, right? So one reason why the Google prediction market was supposedly stopped was that it wasn't private enough. So if there's some event that's of material influence to stock market prices, and everyone who is trading, like all Google employees, know about this event, then everyone is basically an insider. So basically you want to increase accuracy and you want to increase privacy of the information among the crowd. So one way you could do it is to switch to prediction polls, where you're asking for information but not giving a crowd consensus. That can be done easily in a prediction market, where in a prediction poll where you ask a probabilistic estimate and then you just aggregate them statistically. So the Francis Galton example is an example of a prediction poll. James Surowiecki covered it, both markets and polls. And we had a paper a few years ago saying that, if you do the elicitation and aggregation right, actually you can get maybe 10-20% better accuracy by using a prediction poll. But once you're using a prediction poll, you might want to switch from a poll with a large non-selective crowd of hundreds of people to a small elitist crowd. So obviously, there's a lot of work from the Good Judgment Project that has discussed this, and in relation to super forecasters. This work has also been covered by Al Manis and Dan Goldstein, and Phil Tetlock and Doug Gardner's book also covers it. Super forecasting is basically the idea that once you know who the most accurate forecasters are, you can set them together and get them to work with one another, and their accuracy will generally be better than one of a larger non-selective crowd. Another thing you could do is to not switch to polls, but just have a more selective market. Now, with markets, the idea, however, is that usually by having more traders, you add to liquidity, and even if the traders are not very if many of the traders are not very good, well, that's okay, because the price is set up by the marginal trader, right? And so there's more informal sort of theory that it's fine to have some fish in the markets because the sharks come and eat the fish and set the price and make it better. But what if you have a smaller market that just has only sharks, right? Only the best pre-selected traders trade in the market, right? Is that a viable alternative where you can improve privacy because there's fewer traders on the market, but also potentially improve accuracy? So we call this basically a comparison between super polls and supermarkets. And there's another question that you might have, which is that, well, you've been running this market, and then you have some people who are great traders, but you want to know, well, if you were to switch from a prediction market to a polling elicitation, are the best traders also going to be very good forecasters? So have you learned something about the skill of individual forecasters by tracking their performance in a market? So we have two questions here. Basically, if you have a set of forecasters who you think are very good, how would their performance in aggregate compare in a super poll versus a supermarket? and versus regular prediction market. And the other is a question of identification. How efficient are we at identifying accurate forecasters, especially accurate poll forecasters, in a CDA prediction market versus a poll? So this data comes from the last year of the Good Judgment Project, where we had the opportunity to run super forecasters in both a prediction market, LMSR market setup, and have a parallel condition with basically super polls. Super polls or super teams are what the super forecasting book discusses. The year 4 results, basically we hadn't had a chance to ever publish them because we just collected the data after at the last year of the tournament. And then you have a larger group of forecasters who are randomly assigned to either regular prediction polls or LMSR markets. So we had 136 questions, of which 93 are binary. The prediction poll teaming and independent elicitation platform was built internally by the Good Judgment Project, and LMSR prediction market where the technology was supplied by Inkling, which is now called Cultivate. And we're also comparing 2 aggregation methods, the mean or logit with decay, weights, and extremization, which Emil touched on yesterday, or just a simple unweighted linear opinion poll without decay, weights, or extremization. So we want to see what is the impact of different elicitation methods, and within polls, different poll aggregation methods versus the impact of having a smaller select group of forecasters versus a larger group. And so the flow of forecasters was basically that most forecasters who came from polls went to super polls in year 4, and most forecasters who qualified to be super forecasters in prediction markets went to supermarkets. We also gave the forecasters who had qualified before the chance to select, and most of them chose to stay in super polls. And that's one reason why we have slightly more super poll forecasters than those in supermarkets, but the numbers themselves don't affect the results. We did some subsampling analysis to determine that. And so the first big results is we're looking at aggregate Brier score. So we've aggregated all the forecasts. Lower Brier scores are better. And the red ones are regular, larger, non-selective crowds. And the smaller ones are the black marks with one standard there in each direction are the super forecasters. And so we can see that super forecasters outperform regular forecasters when placed in a market, and they also outperform regular forecasters when placed in a team poll. Basically, there's a main effect of what forecasters we have. Super forecasters are better, but there are no main effects of whether you're in a market or an LMSR market or in a poll. It appears that the type of forecasters you have in this case was more important than the type of elicitation system that you have. Now, there was a little bit of a difference between the supermarket and the super poll, and we find that that's partly a function of the aggregation. So we didn't extremize the LMSR prices, we just reported them as is. But we did extremize the super poll forecast. And so if we were doing a little bit more extremization, that's the dotted line, on par with what we did with super polls, the accuracy would actually be very close. There are no significant differences in accuracy to begin with, but if we apply similar level of extremization, we're actually getting very close between super polls and supermarkets. We also find that the main advantage of super polls over regular polls and supermarkets over regular markets is in discrimination rather than calibration. This is before any of the extremization, and that's good to know, because usually it is, with enough data, it's relatively easy to recalibrate. It is harder to extract more discrimination out of a crowd, and so that that speaks positively of the kind of information that super forecasters were bringing into super polls and supermarkets. It's hard to sort of replicate that information or simply change the extremization to get more of it. The other key results for the first question was that the type of forecasters you have was also more important than the aggregation method you were using. So here we're comparing ULNOP to the full algorithm with decay weights and extremization. And what we actually find, so this is within polls, what we find is that elite forecasters or super forecasters, when we aggregate with the simplest measure, ULNOP, they still significantly outperform the more sophisticated aggregations of larger, less selective crowds. So superpole ULNOP is better than full algorithm for regular forecasters. So it seems like individual skills is more important than the elicitation method, and also more important than the aggregation method in this case. The other questions we had was, how efficient are markets, in particular CDA prediction markets, at identifying accurate forecasters if we're then going to send them to a polling to a polling elicitation environment. And here we have data from years 2 and 3 from the Good Judgment Project, where so forecasters basically were competing in year 2, and the best ones were promoted to a super poll condition. So we had 49 forecasters who were in a super poll and they're returning. We had 21 forecasters who were in the CDA market and were promoted to become super forecasters. And we had 51 forecasters who were in a prediction poll setting, either teams or independent, and then they were promoted. And so we can look into their year 3 performance and say, and see, are the forecasters coming from markets any better or worse than those who are newly qualified from polls? Because they're switching setting, we might think that the prediction market, the top traders may not be as good probability forecasters. Perhaps they made a lot of play money for reasons other than being, good probability assessors. But what we actually found was, if you look at independent polls, team polls, and prediction markets, their standardized Brier scores were virtually very similar to one another. So if we qualify someone from an independent poll, that's the red dotted line, from a team poll, from a prediction market, their performance on average was very similar. The only group who outperformed everyone else was the forecasters who came back from super polls, the ones who had already had 1 year as super forecasters and were coming back for a second year. So it seems that the markets were about as efficient as at qualifying super forecasters, even if they are then sent to a different setting. To summarize, returnees from super polls were best, and there was just basically a tie between the newly qualified forecasters from polls and markets. So a little bit of context here. So this comes from geopolitics and economics. We had relatively strong, large data sets from which to qualify forecasters. So at least 100 questions per season, only the top 2%. So out of hundreds of people, we get maybe 10 or 20 to be super forecasters. So we have a lot of information to reliably qualify the elite forecasters. In many settings, you may have less information. And so the benefits of having a select crowd may be a little smaller. But within this setting, we found that basically supermarkets match the performance of super polls. Regular LMSR markets also tied with regular polls. This is something different from what we had found with CDA markets. They were worse than regular polls. And individual skill was the biggest driver of aggregate accuracy, bigger than which elicitation we use and bigger than which aggregation method we used. And finally, we found that the CDA markets identify top skilled forecasters about as efficiently as prediction polls. The upshot from the manager's perspective is that that manager has actually many options. They can move to a prediction poll, but they can also just construct a more selective market with fewer, more successful traders. And as long as that market has some liquidity provision, like in an LMSR market, we have reasons to believe that that small select market would actually outperform the larger, less selective group. Finally, manager also has even the option of going straight from markets to super polls, because it turns out that the forecasters who did well in a market setting were also great probability assessors, and so the knowledge that they found about individual forecasters or traders can carry over to this new environment. I think we have time for one or two questions.
Hey, yeah, thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. Yeah, we do have some time for questions. So audience, if you have a question, you can put it on the Q&A box. I think Bo has a question. I'll abuse my position and ask my question first. My question is about the extremization. Like,
yes,
it's one thing that it's kind of amazing, surprising, but also a little disappointing about the pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering, like, with all the training of forecasters and especially super forecasters,
mm-hmm.
do they eventually get, is that like an equilibrium result? I mean, or will over time, do you need to do less and less extremization? Or kind of amazing that Emil showed that even in his crowd, the extremization really helped. So I wonder if you comment on that.
Yeah, so extremization is somewhat helpful, less so with super forecasters. So the optimal extremization may be 1.2 for super forecasters and 1.5 or 2 with a regular, much larger crowd. The issue there, and John Barron has a paper on that, is that it may be individually, you may be individually maximizing or minimizing your score and doing very well and be perfectly calibrated. But when you combine all the information, you have more information in the crowd. And so an aggregate of perfectly calibrated forecasters may be a little bit underconfident. And so forecasters don't care so much about the aggregate, they care about their own scores. And that is why, it may be efficient to continue extremizing a little bit, even if the forecasters know exactly what they're doing. And this is the first result that we find that this is actually helpful in an LMSR market setting. Now, it could be that the liquidity parameters was set in such a way that it was harder for prices to move to the extremes. It was set at, I believe, 400, and it was the same across the smaller and larger market. So that may have played a role, but it was interesting to see that in the market setting, the prices didn't quite get to the extremes as they should have.
Great, thank you. Bo?
Thanks. Yeah, I was wondering about, so Barb on day one was emphasizing the importance of training and cognitive biases and things that really helps, I think, people forecast better. So I'm wondering, with the prediction market interface, yeah, how did that go? Did they need more training? Did they need different training, et cetera?
Yeah. Well, so we gave them different training because we had to teach them not just how to be good probability assessors, but also how to translate their predictions into trades. And in year 3, we compared the earnings of people who got training, more advanced training, versus those who didn't. And the ones with training made about 10% more money than the ones without training. But it's hard to get from making a little bit more money to making the crowd more accurate, right? So we can trace what was happening at the individual level, but not so much its effect on the crowd because everyone was trading with one another. And so trading seems to help on the individual level, but we don't know if it improves the whole market.